It's an interesting time for me because I had a book that was published in August called Common Ground: How the Crisis of the Earth is Saving Us from Our Illusion of Separation. So it's about living in a time of crisis and change. And as I've been traveling speaking about the book, that's what people want to talk about, the times that we're living in. And so I realized, preparing for this, no one's asked me about writing. I think usually when I've spoken about my writing, there's someone, often a woman, who secretly wants to write a book who asks about that. But this time it's all been about crisis and change. So it was kind of fun for me to reflect on what I've learned from my publication journey. I really appreciated hearing some of the earlier speakers and loved that Alistair lifted up discernment, because I think the stories that I wanted to share were really all stories about discernment, and especially how does living in a time of crisis and change affect our discernment. So that prompted me to go find a piece of paper. I was very proud of myself that I could find it. My first two books, the first one is out of print, and Liz said I should kind of weave show and tell into this, since things this morning were running behind. My second book, The Wisdom to Know the Difference, is about the Serenity Prayer, and partly about how we discern what we should let go of and what we should try and change. I also taught Discerning Our Calls at Pendle Hill for several years before Marcel took up that class when I felt led to work on climate change. So anyway, when I taught that class, I had a sheet of some of my favorite quotes from other people's books on discernment. And I'm just going to read one of them now to kind of frame my talk. It's from a book called Listening Hearts, that was edited by Suzanne Farnham, who, if I remember correctly, is Episcopalian. She had a group of people, including at least one Quaker, and they used some Quaker process. They decided to read the entire Bible and the lives of the saints to kind of sift out what are some lessons in these stories about how to hear and be faithful to God's call. And it's a very pithy little book. It uses a lot of Christian language, if this is a pro or a con for you. But it has bullet points. I think it's the only discernment book I know with bullet points. And so here's a list of conditions favorable. Oh, there's another list of conditions favorable to discernment. This is the list of impediments to discernment: culture, prosperity, self-interest, self-absorption, self-righteousness, desire for security, desire for certainty, human time frames, and self-doubt. So I think at least a few of those could impact writers, or at least have impacted me from time to time. So I'm going to start with the second to last, human time frames, because we're talking about living in a time of crisis. And to be transparent, I actually misremembered the title of this weekend, and I thought the word urgent or urgency was in the title. Maybe that was a draft or I just made it up. But definitely, crisis also has this sense that we might need to act more quickly than we normally act, right? And many writers on discernment caution against too much haste, right? So I definitely have felt that tension in my own work, especially with my last two books, because they are about the climate crisis, and I have felt time urgency about that. My book that came out in 2015 is called Renewable, and it's really the story of why I started doing civil disobedience at age 50 around the climate crisis. But it includes a lot of other threads of my life, including being in the Peace Corps in my 20s in Botswana. And part of what really kind of changed the trajectory of my life was talking on the phone to a friend in Botswana and just saying, how's the weather? Because that's like a main topic of conversation in Botswana. And she said, oh, it's so hot, it's 45 degrees, which the British friends immediately make the appropriate expression. For Americans, that's hot. That's like 113, which when I was in the Peace Corps was a very hot day, and now it's normal. It's not the hottest it gets anymore. And when I got off the phone with her, I started Googling climate change in Botswana and Southern Africa, and learned all kinds of things about how the rains don't come at the right time anymore. Farmers don't know when to plant. Farmers who started growing maize because colonialism encouraged them to do that have now found that the traditional plants, the indigenous plants of sorghum and millet, are better suited to drought. So there's all these things wrapped up in that one conversation that made me feel really under the weight of what's happening to the planet in a deeper way, particularly the injustice of it, that people in Botswana contributed so little to global emissions and are already suffering more than us. So once I figured out that that book was about climate change, I felt some urgency about getting it published, because my book's going to convince everybody to do more, right? You know, what was it? I think self-absorption is on the list for self-righteousness. But here's the thing. I don't think every article I've written has been a leading, but I do think every book I've written has been a leading. I mean, if you're going to spend that much time, right? But I'm not one of those rare authors who feels like God, or whatever word you like better, that God didn't download a manuscript in my brain, right? I got something more like, you know, a long fortune cookie message and an impulse to go write a few hundred pages about it. And so for me, there's been a lot of mucking around, trying to figure out what am I actually led to say about this topic. I also have friends who are not Quaker from a writers group I was part of for 10 years who can have an idea, write an outline, write a sample chapter, write a proposal, send it to their agent, and if a publisher sends them a contract, they'll write that book. And if they don't get a contract, they don't write that. But anybody here can do that? Like, those people make more money than me, but that's not how I work. If it's a leading, I just kind of struggle with the idea until it takes shape. And in the case of renewable, I did feel this crisis tension, in part because at the same time I was the clerk of Earthquaker Action Team, or EQUATE. And we were doing nonviolent direct action. And I felt what friends call well used in that work. And when I was mucking around my third or fourth draft of the book, I was like, am I being well used? Rewriting this again and again. And I wasn't sure. I did finally figure out the thread of the book, partly from feedback, which I'll talk about in a minute. But in hindsight, which is always so much clearer, I think I made at least one mistake, and maybe two, out of a sense of impatience with the publishing process. The first mistake was I sent my agent what Anne Lamott calls your shitty first draft. Anne Lamott, in case people don't know, is an American author who wrote a great book on writing, who advises that everybody just write a terrible first draft. And I've taken that advice to heart. And because the agent for this book really felt like way opening,
Jennifer, are you on this?
I am. I was trying to determine. I think we lost the visual and
Well,
potential.
she lost our visual, I'm working on it.
Oh,
Just
okay.
let them know it'll
Right.
come back.
All right, Sam's on it. I have confidence in Sam. First draft. The agent said, well, this manuscript's kind of all over the place, and you're not a famous enough activist for anybody to want to publish your memoir, so no thanks. So that, I don't know, which is this? Self-doubt, self-interest, desire for security, like that hit a few buttons. And so I decided I wasn't going to pitch mainstream publishers, which is who published my first two books. And I also thought, well, climate change is urgent. I just need to get it out there as soon as possible so I can focus on activism. And so I chose a hybrid publisher named She Writes Press. Does everybody know what that means?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, no. A hybrid publisher basically shares the cost of publication with the author. So I had to put up some money, and they put up some money. They have a very professional editorial team and cover designing, so it's not like self-publishing. They have distribution to get in bookstores, but it's really not like being at Random House either. And there were some good and some bad things about that experience. But mostly I kind of wondered if my impatience was unfaithful. And there were a couple things about it, but the biggest one is that I didn't feel like I found a very big audience for that book that came out in 2015. And then in 2016, Donald Trump got elected. And in 2017, I immediately became much more in demand as a speaker. And I thought, gee, if that book was coming out now, a book about a 50-year-old woman getting arrested for the first time might actually get more media. I'm sure it would have gotten more media in 2017 because more people were feeling urgent about a lot of issues and willing to take more risk. So I don't know if I would have found a publisher or not, but going into the current book, I definitely then leaned the other direction into patience, and so that book took 8 years, which is longer than any of the others. I appreciated Alistair mentioning his experience of that as well, and like Alistair, I rewrote it pretty much constantly for 8 years, which Janaki can attest to because she's on my support committee. I'll say one more thing about the new book. Well, I'll say a few things about the new book. The leading for the new book really started actually before the old book was over, and it came as a spiritual message at a conference down the road in Haverford College. And the words that came as a message were, it's not about us saving the earth will survive whether we do or not. But the crisis of the earth is saving us from our illusion of separation. So I want to ask you, just for a moment, what you think that phrase means, and on Zoom too. And I'll just call on a few people and get a few answers from Zoom or the room. By the way, it's after lunch, so I know this needs to be participatory. What do you think that means, the illusion of separation? Go ahead.
But we're not intricately dependent on nature and the planet.
Okay, so
we can survive if we demonstrate.
Yeah, we're not separate from the planet, and if we poison the air or water or climate, we will not be immune from that.
That our tendency to create in-groups and out-groups is a natural way of things and the only way of things.
Yeah, the divisions between people and different communities, absolutely. Anybody on Zoom have one? Okay, go ahead.
The illusion of separation speaks to the tendency of humans to pretend. I can pretend that this doesn't matter and go on and
Right.
pretend to live my life.
Yeah. Yeah. Great.
Someone's on chat.
Go ahead. You go.
Well, I just recently read that best friends tend to kind of sync brainwaves as they interact in a certain way, that you think you're an independent person, but the people you spend quality time with affect your brain.
Wow. Yeah. There's so many ways we're interconnected. And I heard there was a message in the chat.
That- Me sharing the prompt and asking if friends would like to share, but I do not see any.
Okay, great.
The difference between the phrase from Descartes, I think, therefore I am, and Ubuntu.
Ah, yes. So this book is a lot about Ubuntu in Southern Africa, this concept of interconnection, which is also, there's an Irish word that I'm not sure how to pronounce, Methel? Okay, yeah. That has a similar connotation. And what was the other thing you said? And
Descartes.
And Descartes, yeah. In the new book, there's a chapter in India, and there was an Indian man who told me that the whole climate crisis was the fault of Descartes. And I think lots of people had theories about the origin and the illusion of separation. And that's one of them, like that level of separation. I would say that in the book I talk about all of those things. I also talk about the spiritual separation from spirit, although that is not as prominent a theme. Because I'm trying to cast a wide net of readers, but it's there throughout my experience of shattering illusions and feeling guided by spirit through the process. So
We have a share from
okay,
it says
go ahead.
illusion of separation might be the absence of awareness about interdependence of all life forms and environment.
Right, that's great. So I want to notice that you all had no trouble coming up with answers, and that's been my experience on this book tour. But it was not my experience 8 years ago when I started working on this book. In fact, I shared what I was doing with a member of my meeting who used to be on the editorial board of the Philadelphia Inquirer, so someone in publishing, and she nodded, and at that time the book was called The Illusion of Separation, and she said, you might want to come up with something catchier. And indeed, for the first several years, I found that lots of people kind of squinted. Some people would go, oh wow, that's so cool, and other people would be like, huh? The first time I read anything from it out loud, a friend invited me to a writer's retreat in Vermont. So again, not Quakers. And I read the story of hearing this message at Haverford College, and it just landed like, uncooked potato or whatever, did not resonate with the group. And the guy running it, seemed to be amazed that I had ever published previous books because it was that bad, So it was 2 days though, so I got to rewrite it, and I realized this is an abstract idea for a lot of people, so I need to start with a story. So then I came back and I started with a story that I helped kind of confirm this leading, and it was an activist from New York named Eddie Batista, who was part of bringing people together after Hurricane Sandy slammed New York. And they had a meeting with people from all 5 boroughs about how they didn't want to just bounce back, they wanted to bounce forward. And they got some of their demands into government plans after Hurricane Sandy, and even more importantly, they formed the groundwork of a coalition that then got one of the nation's best climate laws passed in New York State. So that story is now pretty close to the front of the book. But when he was speaking, the thing Eddie said that really struck me was that Hurricane Sandy, basically the flooding churned up a lot of the toxic waste in New York, in places like Brooklyn, where my kids now live, Staten Island, old lead plants, all that toxic waste was spreading. And many of the communities that have those kind of facilities tend to be lower income, often communities of color. But in New York City, they're gentrifying. So you could be paying a lot of money for a property and not know that you're on an old lead factory, right? And that climate change is threatening in so many ways, but one of them is spreading pollution, which we also saw in the Los Angeles wildfires. So my observation is that one benefit of this book taking so long is that more people get what I'm saying. I also observe that if I had published this book earlier, like say 2019, 2020, it might have come out during the surge in interest in racial justice, and I may have been criticized as a white person talking about racial justice, and especially talking about our common stake, because I write about, like I just said with gentrification, it's uneven who's most exposed to toxic waste, but it actually affects everybody. And that's kind of one of the core messages of the book, from climate change, which is affecting Botswana and India and many other places more than, people are more vulnerable than the United States, but still my kids live in Brooklyn. And my daughter teaches at a fancy private school that had to lock the doors because after 5 days of raining, there were cars floating down the street, right? So one of the core messages of the book is this dual truth that climate change is very unequal, and we were talking about how it's affecting people in Bolivia very direly, and it also affects everybody, which as an activist, it feels important to hold both sides of that. The last thing I'll say about the timing piece is that I did finally find a publisher, 7 Stories Press. It took them several months to send me a contract, several months to really get the editorial process underway. And thank goodness, because otherwise the book would have been at the printer when the 2024 election happened. I had said to a junior editor, I don't know when, sometime in 2024, we may need to write an epilogue depending on who wins the US election. And she said, oh, no, your themes are perennial, it won't matter. Which told me that she had an assumption about who was gonna win that I didn't share. Because in between all this book writing, I also have done work for a group called Choose Democracy that I mentioned this morning. My friend Daniel Hunter has written a book about what if Trump wins. He hired me to help prepare materials for activists in case things went the way they're going. And because I was slow and the publisher was slow, it was sort of a reciprocal thing. But the good news is I got a chance to at least update the intro and a few other bits to acknowledge the election. So I want to give you one more question, and this time I'm going to ask you to turn to a neighbor. It's just real brief, and folks on Zoom, we're not going to put you in breakout groups. We're going to ask that you put your thoughts in the chat. And the question is, how do you relate to this question of urgency, whether you're a writer or a publisher or an editor? Sometimes we really benefit from feeling that there's a deadline. And sometimes it can get in the way. So just take a moment and think about what's your relationship to time and deadlines in doing this work. Just real quickly, headline. Thought? Great, thank you, I know that was short. I would love to hear a few brief recaps of your relationship with time and urgency as we're living in these times that feel urgent and everybody feels like they don't have enough time to do all the things, at least everybody who sends me an email. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll start. I worked in publishing for nearly 30 years, so I've lived on deadlines.
Yeah.
Now I've retired, I'm always quaker commitments. I'm still living on deadlines, but they're self-imposed.
Okay.
Habit.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but we're a periodicals publisher,
Right,
so we
right.
live on deadlines and we definitely have a bias towards shipping. You know, you made a commitment, people are depending on you and you're professionals and you never know what's gonna land and we trust our professionalism and our process and that once something has gone through the process, you put it out there
Yeah,
and see what happens.
right. I love that.
I find for the most part urgency to be destructive because when you finish what you're working on, there's going to be more to do. So, you know, urgency can be self-defeating if you live that way.
So I appreciate having different experiences.
I felt a sense of urgency for the book I wrote, and it turned out to be that it was the perfect time.
There you go. So the discernment is knowing when is the urgency helpful. And I do think that, you know, just to abstract to the larger political moment, that there are things it's easier to do in the first year of an authoritarian president that might be harder in the fourth year, right? Or even the second or third. So the sense of time constraint is not just anxiety. You know. Was there anybody on Zoom who wanted to share anything or anything in the chat?
Yes, it was quite prolific, Chris.
Okay.
Wonderfully lengthy, in a good way. So I can maybe read two. I'll just read the first two and then we can go back and forth. Okay. So Barb Birch says, I don't usually have deadlines imposed by others, so I make up my own soft deadlines because having a due date in mind helps me with time management. And Christine Evans says, I've been working slowly with an author-writer about Christian anti-Jewishness for several years. I have felt bad about not getting it moving faster because of God. Mental health has been a major slowing factor, but I've added to it. So those are the first two, many more.
Great, thank you. Thank you, friends. So I'll tell two more little tidbits about the timing of this book, Common Ground. One was that I did have lots of people read it over time. So many that when I wrote the acknowledgements, I was like embarrassed at how many people's time I had taken. But one of those people early on was George Lakey, who some of you may know, a Quaker activist, author, mentor of mine. And I think it was probably 2019 that I gave him a section to read of stories in Louisiana. And I have to say, with deep gratitude to George, he's been like one of the most encouraging people of my work in my life. And so he comes in with this kind of cheerleader energy. Eileen, you're such a great writer. This book is so important, the world really needs it. I hope you finish it soon, which he continued to say until 2025 when it was published. But the other thing he said was, these stories are amazing, too bad they're all so depressing. Now here's the thing about how I found the stories. I really felt like it was way opening. I did not set out and say, let me go find stories of people overcoming the illusion of separation that will bring hope to the masses. I just kind of stumbled into them. So as I said, under the first Trump administration, I got more speaking engagements. And if I was being flown somewhere, I would just see what else is going on around there so that I can not waste too many travel miles. So for example, I was speaking to the Quaker yearly meeting that was meeting in New Mexico. And I kind of looked at the map and asked the friends I was talking to over the phone, oh, I see, you're not that far from the Navajo Nation. I've heard there's a lot of environmental issues there. And they said, oh, we live on the Navajo Nation. Come stay with us. So I was like, way opening. And they introduced me to someone who introduced me to more people. But the Navajo Nation is a really sobering example of what colonialism has wrought. I met people who live from here to Upmeads. If Upmeads was a hill of uranium that was just planted over with grass. And they had been advocating for years to get that cleaned up. And because they had been advocating, there was at least a fence around it now and a sign, but for many decades, and in some other parts of the Navajo Nation, there wasn't even a sign to warn people, right? And at first I wasn't quite sure how this story fit into the book, which is a lot of people fighting fossil fuels. But by the time I got around to publishing, the Biden administration and now many others are advocating for nuclear again. And so stories about what happened the last time we did that in a hurry feel very relevant, and it wasn't obvious to me when I first went there. Another story was I was invited to speak on a Sierra Club panel in New Orleans. They actually reached out to a Black-led organization in Philly that Earthquake Reaction Team, or EQUATE, was partnering with, POWER, and said, could you send someone to be on a panel on environmental justice? And they were like, no, we're too busy. So someone called me and said, would you want to go? And I said, yes, please. Way opening, because Louisiana is just a textbook case for both climate change and environmental injustice. And because I was on this panel, the woman who was leading the panel invited me to come along with an international group of climate activists to visit the Vietnamese community in New Orleans, which is very famous for a successful campaign right after Katrina, when the city tried to dump their toxic waste in their neighborhood. And they, many immigrants, decided to organize and partnered with their Black neighbors to stand up to this toxic dumping. More recently, a big company called Entergy was trying to build a gas plant in their neighborhood, and they lost that fight. So that was one of the stories. Both of these were stories George was reacting to and saying, in his experience, he was probably still promoting his book, How We Win, right? It's like, people want to hear how we win, Eileen. And I had stories, some of people who won and some that were not as encouraging. So I heard that feedback and grappled with it, and I realized, no, I'm really led to tell these stories, and George isn't wrong about what people want. So I put the New York story earlier, along with some other stories a little earlier, but I also told a different story to frame what I'm doing. And I'm curious, how many people have heard of the Baton Rouge bus boycott? All right, brownie points for Liz. Not the Montgomery bus boycott, which was Rosa Parks. The Baton Rouge bus boycott happened a few years earlier, in the early 1950s, very germinating stage of the civil rights movement. They were also protesting racial segregation on the buses, and that boycott lasted a week and didn't accomplish much. But when Rosa Parks refused to move on the bus, and the people of Montgomery, the women of Montgomery especially, had long been dreaming of a bus boycott, the folks in Baton Rouge called the folks in Montgomery and said, this is what we learned. Yeah. People can't sustain it unless they have rides to work, because our people need to work. So in Montgomery, they organized for over a year rides for people to go to work, and that campaign became one of the landmarks, you know, of the civil rights movement. It was the campaign that launched Dr. King's career and a series of other direct action. So I tell that story early to frame the fact that I'm telling all these other stories of people losing, because it feels like a really important time to grapple with why we're not winning. And especially since Trump's re-election, I do feel that that message is landing with audiences better than if I had written a happy book about how the climate movement is winning, which would have felt outdated, you know, while it was at print. So, again, just reinforcing, my experience was that patience was helpful, and I also still feel the tension between being an activist and being a writer, and still feel frustrated with how long it can take me sometimes to figure these things out. Anything else about timing anyone wants to say before I shift to feedback? Go ahead.
Do you ever get to the point where you've got that, but you have to step back and put things in order before you start working?
I've got that.
You have the idea, you have your general idea,
Yeah.
but there's priority of what you need to do so that you can move forward.
Yeah, but that's part of the mucking around. Like it's
Okay,
so for like
that's your
this
term.
book, that's my term for spending a lot of time at my desk looking out the window. So for example, this book, what's about the Serenity Prayer, my first outline was I'm going to tell stories about serenity, and then I'm going to tell stories about courage, and then I'm going to tell stories about wisdom. But after writing a kind of, you know, rocky, rough draft, I realized that that wasn't supported by the stories. That many of the stories, and I started interviewing people in a way that also felt like way opening. Many of the stories people had to let go before they could do the courageous thing, or vice versa. Sometimes doing the courageous thing, then they could let go. Actually, you just reminded me of a dream, and since I'm looking at Marcel, I'll tell one dream story from this book. The people who I interviewed were diverse in lots of different ways, including race and religion. And a woman whose interview is pretty early on in the book had a dramatic story about racism as a thing where she had to navigate, you know, what to try and change and what to let go of. And I, in one version, pretty close to the end of being done, told that story kind of early on in the book. And then I worried that it was too much for the reader on page 2 of a book on the Serenity Prayer, or whatever it was. But then there was this part of me, maybe the self-righteous part, that was like, but I can't take out racism because that would be bad. Like, I have to tell this hard story. So then I had a dream of being in like a Jeep and feeling stuck in the mud. And I don't know whether I got out of the Jeep or somehow I got a bigger perspective, and I realized I wasn't actually stuck in the mud. The front right tire was a little bit in the mud. And all I needed to do was back up, and then I would be clear. And when I woke up, what I understood was that it was about this dilemma, and it wasn't about being stuck, it was just about, like, the front. That story shouldn't be on page 2. So I still told that story, but I found
That's what I'm referring to.
a better place to help the reader, right? Because for me, the first draft is what am I led to say, and then somewhere down the line it has to be, will this work for the reader? Will they know what I'm talking about?
And that takes time.
It does take time. It does.
I have a hand up online, Daphne.
Oh,
Go ahead.
hello, friends. I my kind of thoughts about timing. Actually, thank you very much, because it's really interesting thinking about this. I'm mainly involved, obviously in quite a small way, with publishing Quaker texts in Russia. And Russia is very different to a lot of places in relation to attitudes to climate change. There's a lot of denial, and in some ways there's a sort of, I've heard people saying, survival is what I'm preoccupied with. I can't think about climate change. And then there's a very repressive government, and then there's a high dependency on fossil fuels. It's very hard to be an eco-activist in Russia. And but we know that this is a big issue, and it's affecting Russian people. It will affect Russian people from now on, just as it's affecting the rest of us. And so we have published texts about the climate issue, Quaker texts. And I suppose what's been in my mind really has been that at some point the awareness is going to get greater and greater. And in a way, the longer it is before that happens, the worse the situation is going to be by then. And that it's important to have some, as it were, sustaining texts, informative texts available for those people who might want to read them and access them. Having heard what's been said so far, though, that might be a complete error, because from what you're saying, it sounds like, publishing the book at the right time when it's needed is the right thing to do. But
If you can predict that, if you can predict that.
Observations on that.
Thank you. I'll say one more thing about the timing, and then I'm going to pivot. And what you shared actually is a good segue. The other criticism I heard from some people was that, this was such a random assortment of places. Louisiana, the Navajo Nation, India, Minnesota, And the amazing thing was that in 2021, Equate's campaign director got another job, and I was asked to step in as the campaign director right when Equate had started a campaign against Vanguard, which I know is in England too. I'm not sure if it's as well known, but it's one of the world's biggest asset managers and the biggest investor in fossil fuels. And as it turned out, the biggest investor in that gas plant in the Vietnamese community, the biggest investor in Exxon, the biggest investor in the pipeline fight in Minnesota that I spent a month at, the biggest investor in Adani Coal in India, the coal company on the Navajo Nation. That campaign just showed another illusion of separation, because the money connects it all, right? And had I pushed for earlier publication or self-published, which is, a possibility now, I would have missed that thread, which ended up being very important in tying the other stories together. To the point about climate denial, I want to read a tiny bit from the book and use it as an example of something that came up yesterday around support committees or accountability committees, which is a little different than writer feedback, especially from your editor. One of the stories in the book was another trip to Louisiana. I went to sit in on the Louisiana oil and gas industry meeting, which was a trip. 300 people who work for Exxon and Shell and all these companies. And I put on my only pair of high heels and tried to kind of fit in. Even though I wrote freelance writer on my registration, I was trying to keep a low profile. And that is a very funny and depressing story. That's chapter 1. But the point I'll share here is where my support committee was helpful, because I found it so alienating. So this is every chapter has a section at the end, which is kind of my lessons from the experience. So I talk about the fact that my father worked on a Sun oil tanker. My great-grandfathers were coal miners in upstate Pennsylvania. When I was visiting with frontline communities in Louisiana, I started to really feel the need to talk to industry workers. And ways suddenly opened in amazing ways that I got to have conversations with industry workers. And let's see. So I'll pick up from there. I was able to make a connection with the speaker. In each of these encounters, I was able to make a connection with the speaker, to feel empathy for their choices, even when we didn't share the same politics. In contrast, I felt painfully alienated from the Louisiana oil and gas executives who were risking other people's lives for their own profit. At the conference happy hour, I tried approaching a few women, but struggled to chit-chat, even though I normally love engaging strangers. I believe that on a spiritual level, we are all part of a larger whole, but it felt like a thin fish line of connection, hard to see under the hotel chandeliers. By the way, this was a hotel that flooded during Katrina, and so I was sitting there listening to climate denial in a hotel that flooded during Katrina. Although I had gone to hear their side of the story, I couldn't stop the running critique in my head about how delusional they were. Did my Quaker belief that there was that of God in every person mean I had to see the divinity in them? I believed it did, but I wasn't sure how to do that, given that companies like Exxon were responsible for an unfathomable amount of harm. The human death toll from climate change could easily be in the hundreds of millions. I boiled down my dilemma to a challenging theological question. How do I love my neighbor when he is killing our other neighbors? Back home, I shared this experience with the Quaker Support and Accountability Committee that meets with me regularly to help me stay in touch with Spirit's guidance for my work. One member said she could empathize with the industry's feeling of victimhood, which I had pointed out with incredulity. It is true that people want to sue them, she said. It's true that people want them to pay more taxes, one of the recurring complaints at the conference. Put this way, by a woman of color who is quick to empathize with those hurt by industry, I could glimpse just how executives felt beleaguered. From their worldview, they were just defending their profits, which was their obligation to their shareholders in a capitalist system. So that prompts me to do a kind of thought experiment and try and see, Alistair mentioned truth, like, is there any truth in what I heard? And, so I start trying to untangle that a little bit. It was humbling to acknowledge ways I could relate to the speakers. Not so long ago, I thought of the environment as a place to camp on vacation rather than the air I breathe and the water I drink. Not so long ago, I was unaware that my daughter's asthma was likely caused by an oil refinery in a neighborhood only a few miles from our home. And not so long ago, I thought that choosing the green fund for my retirement account meant that I wasn't investing in fossil fuels, when in fact I was. It was easy to believe that I wasn't part of the problem, though of course that is part of the illusion of separation. So I'm glad I mentioned that in the book to lift up support committees. That was feedback along the way that was spiritual feedback, not reading feedback. I did at the very beginning ask people on my committee to read some drafts and then realized that asking them to read literally thousands of pages of rewrites was not maybe what they signed up for. So I want to share a few other stories though about feedback, because knowing when to take somebody else's feedback is part of the Quaker tradition, right? We believe in clearness committees and collective discernment, but doesn't mean that everybody's always right about everything. What was it that Alistair said yesterday? He said a phrase that we don't use here. if something I could be wrong.
Consider you may
Take
be
it
mistaken.
Oh, that's great. Is that a British thing that people say a lot? Say it again.
Think it possible that you may be mistaken.
Yeah.
Think it possible that,
That might be mistaken.
is that quoting somebody in
Yes,
particular?
it's in the crisis and queries.
Ah, okay.
Our yearbook, yeah.
I love that. So here's the tricky thing, right? I think that's really, really important. And I'm gonna tell a funny story about myself. I wanna be clear. This is a story about myself, although it happened here yesterday. So I arrived late and learned that many of you had started worship over in Upmeads. And we discovered David was on the facing bench and Tom as well. And so we were realizing that we were all gonna walk over to Upmeads together. And David, please forgive me for using you in this story. David sort of pointed that way as I was getting ready to go that way to go to Upmeads. And I forget what you said, but like, yeah, Upmeads is this way. And I said, really? I was very quick to assume that I had been mistaken. I've always gone out the back door. Wait, where is Upmeads? For friends online, Upmeads is right over there. It's another building. We walked out, and because Pendle Hill has so many doors and paths, there are actually 4 ways to get from here to Upmeads. We got out, and I realized that David was assuming we would walk down the driveway to what used to be the front door. Now, I have no idea if this is true, but there used to be a family who lived there. So no one ever, and you can tell who's been here a long time, no one ever went by the front door. Everyone always went by the back door. And then I was like, no, we should go this way. And David said, well, I've only been here 3 weeks. And I thought, what I didn't say out loud is, I've been here 33 years. I've led workshops in Upmeads. What the bleepity bleep is what I said. A man confidently says, go that way, and I did. A minute and a half. I notice the women are laughing. So my husband really doesn't believe that I do this because I present as very confident. I don't think self-doubt has mostly prevented me from doing what I'm led to do, but it's wasted a lot of my time going a little bit the wrong direction because somebody else told me to. And I'm kind of fed up with that. Like, so that's where I feel the urgency of climate change. And I'll give you a more recent and writing example. The copy editing for this book, thank God again for Jonathan, who's a copy editor, helped me navigate the copy editing. Anybody else hate that part of the process? No? But I know we have editors here, sorry. So my copy editor, who I never met, and I believe in editing. I am not one of those authors who think I don't need an editor. I know I need an editor. That's part of why I was so impatient to find a publisher, because I needed an editor. But she made a number of suggestions I really didn't agree with. And one was, in Louisiana, the Vietnamese community, and also in India, I had a few stories about fishermen. And she suggested that I change it to fisher people. That's how I reacted. It was like, nobody says that. But then I wasted an hour and a half Googling fisher people and read all these articles about how even women who fish for a living don't want to be called fisher people, they want to be called fishermen. Because I felt like I had to be sure before I could reject this edit, which appeared more times than I expected. I didn't realize how many times I mentioned the fisherman. Until the first couple I reworded it, right? I'm trying to be a dutiful, cooperative author. I changed it to communities where people fish for a living and things like the first 2 times, and then I was like, what am I doing? I also felt bad rejecting the copy editor's suggestions, which I'm guessing Bill McKibben doesn't waste his time like that. So that goes back to our little impediments to discernment list.
We expect some of our decisions and edits to get rejected.
Right, yes, John, you said that, yeah, thank you, copy editors. But culture was first on impediments, so whatever that cultural message I got, that I shouldn't be too sure of myself, self-doubt, and then the opposite, self-righteousness. Because you could respond to that conditioning the other way and just say no to everything. So I think there's stuff in there that I don't hear writers talk about enough that I think, especially when you don't have tight deadlines, can get in the way of us being faithful. So that's what I'm interested in paying attention to, is what gets in the way of me being faithful. So I'll just say one other thing that was in the hard to discern category had to do with the other part of my identity, being a white person. The first Quaker space where I read any of the book was the Quaker Institute for the Future. And I read part of whatever version it was of the introduction. And I really felt like the audience was engaging with me. And then one person said, you should cut yourself out of this narrative and kind of write it. They didn't quote Studs Terkel, but if people know Studs Terkel, he just interviewed people, told their stories, and there was no narrator in it. You should cut yourself out because you're telling the stories of frontline communities and just quote them, not yourself. And then some other friend said, no, I want to hear more about your journey, Eileen. And I felt like everything they said there was conflicting. But the thing about my own race and realizing that despite all this female conditioning, I also have white conditioning, and I don't want to overlook things that I might not pick up on myself, meant that I also had many friends of color read, especially the section on race, which I think was good and a useful thing to do. But I'm just aware I am now also spending the time of other people who are very busy, and especially in Quaker circles, invited to be on every frickin' committee, right? So there's something of a dance in that discernment too. Likewise, this whole narrative about how do we talk about inequality and also talk about our shared stake was something that clarified for me over the 8 years of writing the book. When I started, well, that group that I mentioned that didn't understand what the illusion of separation was, they liked the writing much better of my second draft where I started with environmental racism, but none of them had ever heard of environmental racism. This is 2017. And I mean, that term's been around at least since the 80s, but in the last 8 years, it has become better known. So there's a chapter in the book where I really lay out what does this pattern have to do with racism? And I use Ibram Kendi's definition where he talks about policies and ideas that create racial inequality. And I kind of break down, these are all the policies around land use, and these are some of the ideas that reinforce them. And that chapter stayed in all the way through. It was one of the first interviews I did. But the chapter after it clarified to really be about what's up with the white people who live almost next door, right? Because in Louisiana, as in many communities, and we have at least a few people here from Chester, right? One community might be living closest to the smells and in earshot of the sirens when there's an accident and able to smell the chemicals. But the neighborhood a mile away is still breathing that stuff, even if they don't see the flares. And I started to notice, as is true in Chester, Joan is nodding fortuitously, is that a word? Joan is nodding in agreement because she has long worked with a group that I also work with now, Circle, Chester Residents Concerned for Quality Living. And like many of the people I met in my travels, their leader is very quick to say, there's no dome over Chester that keeps the bad air in. It's coming to Wallingford, it's coming to Swarthmore and Media. and that this whole county actually has high cancer rates. But the people on this end of the county are not aware of it. So that was clearly a part of the illusion of separation. It made me dig more into the history of race as a tool for divide and conquer. And round about 2020, I got worried if I would get canceled for lifting that up as an important part of racism's role in society. It is something that directly oppresses people of color, and it also divides workers, divides communities, and makes it possible for would-be authoritarians to pit us against each other more easily. So again, feels like easier to say in 2025 than maybe a few years ago. I also got clearer because of the people I was interviewing, that this wasn't just an idea in my head, it was what people on the ground were saying. And one of the interviews was with Daniel Hunter, who I mentioned this morning, who is the person who I said made this book on what if Trump wins, where you could choose what you thought might happen. Daniel is one of the smartest people I know. Campaign strategist, has been an advisor to many groups, including climate groups, going through racial strife. And when I went to visit him, he put language to some of the patterns I was seeing. He said that there were like 4 different ways he saw climate groups navigating race. And just real briefly, they're basically to have a race-neutral campaign where you just kind of say, we're all in this together, which actually can work really well in the short term and can really backfire in the long term because racial differences always rear their head, at least in the United States. The second was educating about race, which I described some of the Quate's experience in that section. We kind of do a little bit of different ones, but using our work as an opportunity to educate our membership about racial inequality. A third option is what I call kind of race-centric. And the example I used for that is I went to a climate conference organized by the HBCUs, the historically Black colleges and universities. And so that time I was surrounded by 300 people who looked different than me and felt so much more at home than with the oil and gas people, also in New Orleans, and really moved by the sense of spirituality they actually had in their academic environment, but a really clear focus. The climate conference was called Fighting for Our Lives. So all that objectivity stuff I learned in grad school was, our communities, our universities are threatened by climate change. And then the fourth one, Daniel says is that it's what he was gravitating toward and it's what I gravitate toward. And what I kept seeing working well in the stories of people I interviewed was what he called spiritual oneness with an awareness of difference. So like Dr. King, would I talk about how, we are all interconnected without sugarcoating the reality of how racism operates on people. So the other thing that was mentioned yesterday was truth and telling the truth. And that is very important to me. I spent a lot of time fact-checking and trying to make sure what I was saying was true. But the trickier thing was how to find the right balance when more than one thing is true. So I'll just give a very quick example of that. In the opening chapter, where I'm with these oil and gas people, I talk a little bit about Hurricane Katrina. And I had started reading and writing about Hurricane Katrina actually in 2005 and incorporating it into a college class I was teaching on racism at the time. And so when I wrote the first draft, it was all about inequality, which Katrina was a great example of how unevenly climate change is falling. But I realized on my final rewrite, I realized that that story is missing a piece, so I added 2 sentences somewhere. Yeah. So I'll just read a few sentences to see as an example of what I added to try and balance out the truth a little bit. The impact of Katrina was both broadly felt and unequal. Across the region, over 1.5 million people evacuated of every race, class, and generation. Many lost their employment as well as their homes from the disaster. That's the added part. In bowl-shaped New Orleans, 80% of the city flooded, even the Ritz-Carlton, where the oil and gas people were meeting. The largest concentration of deaths was in the lower Ninth Ward, the predominantly Black neighborhood that 90 years earlier was chosen as the site of the Industrial Canal, which provides industry ships a shortcut from Lake Pontchartrain to the Mississippi River. Experts long predicted catastrophe if storm surge breached the canal. Still, it was not properly reinforced. So, and then I go on to talk about more of the things that Katrina revealed. But I named this, and I'm gonna kind of pause after this point to see what's on your minds. We're at a moment in the United States anyway, and where speaking truth feels extra important, but also being mindful of how the truth lands and discerning about how to be as effective as possible in our messaging feels really important. Large parts of the electorate have been kind of written off as people who might never vote for a Democrat again, even though many of them, some of them, people who were environmental activists in one of my stories. And so I think we're at a moment where having like really living into that belief that there's that of God in every person means seeing it in the oil exec, means seeing it in the white community that denies there's any environmental racism a few blocks away. But we can't do that, or we can, I hope we don't do that in a way that forgets to affirm that of God and the people living next to the oil refinery, right? Often I find friends give messages in meeting that kind of go one way or the other. And holding both at the same time is really freaking hard. But I think it's part of what I feel led to try and articulate during this time. So I'm gonna pause. I'm gonna have a participatory exercise for you after a little bit of Q&A or comments, but I wanna open it up first. Is there anybody on the room who wants to go first? I meant the Zoom room.
You said in the room.
I know I did, I'm tired. All right, anybody in this room who wants to go first? And someone can point out to me if you notice hands going up. Anybody have a question or a comment? David?
If I may, I've got a comment about coming from some of the reading I've done about meaning, which is in senses about discernment. One is that it's only with multiple metaphors that we can have multiple lenses and have that different understanding of something. Always if you look through one lens, you'll have a less rich image. The other thing is a story that some of you may have heard about the use of a map by a military contingent in the Alps, which I think is super interesting. And the story is this, it's quite short. So a military contingent went on exercise in the Alps in the First World War. The weather came in and they were lost for 3 days and thought dead. And then suddenly, miraculously, they emerged. And their commanding officer, who was not with them, said, "How did you do it?" And they said, "Well, after a day, we thought we were all dead. We were lost, the snow was coming down, but then one of us found a map in our pocket, in his pocket. And we looked at this map, and we thought, okay, we can do this. So we waited the storm out, we found our bearings, and we followed it carefully, and we came out of the mountains." I think that seemed not so incredible. When, and I think this is apocryphal, but it's very interesting. When the commanding officer looked at the map, it was not a map of the Alps, it was a map of the Pyrenees. And the lesson from that I draw, which the author draws, is even with an imperfect map, having a plan, some plan,
Right.
can get you out of things. And we've always got an imperfect plan, in fact, it's never perfect.
Right. That's great, thank you.
It used to be that when I listened to somebody talk that I didn't necessarily agree with, I could assume that they were speaking truth as they understood it. Life has gotten much more complicated now because I can no longer assume that they are speaking truth as they understand it. They are speaking something that they hope they can convince me of, whether it's truth or not. But to constructively interact with somebody, you have to find this truth as they understand it. If it really is truth as they understand it.
Yeah. I appreciate that, and I'll just add that the story I told about the Louisiana oil and gas executives, I feel like that made me a better activist, because a few months later, Equate interrupted a corporate shareholder meeting. And I felt like I spoke to the CEO differently. I started by saying, I understand that you think your job is to maximize shareholder profits, and that's what everybody else thinks your job is. And we who are interrupting you seem really off base because we're asking you to actually care about something else. But this is why we are. Like I just started by saying, I know we sound crazy, but anyway.
You don't start by denigrating the fact that they have a responsibility to do their job.
Right.
Have you always had an agent?
The first two books I had an agent. After I alienated, or I didn't alienate, I just sent it to her too soon and then felt embarrassed is really what happened. So this book, because it was hybrid, I didn't need an agent. And by the time I got to this one, that woman had retired. And it wouldn't have really been up her alley anyway. I spent quite a while looking for an agent and not finding one. And ended up finding the publisher through a personal contact because it's the same publisher that George Lakey used. And it was definitely harder without an agent, but I finally did it that way. Anybody else? Myself.
Do you have an inkling of your next book?
It's funny, I haven't gotten the fortune cookie yet. I have this wondering if it will be about gender. Because that was a theme that kind of came up in some of the stories, but I wasn't clear about how to write about it very much. There's a few examples in there. But I don't know. It's partly because those are the stories that are harder for me to tell. David, it was hard for me to tell the story of following you out the door.
I'm glad it served.
Yes. Thank you.
You had a lot of energy telling that story.
I had a lot of energy, and I think in the past I wouldn't have told it. So there's something there that probably won't have been solved by the time I get around to publishing another book.
Really?
Just a guess. Anything else? So here's my suggestion. It was kind of an accident that they gave me so much time, I think. So this is a 2-hour block. We're due to go till 3:15, and then there's a break, and then there's the next panel. And my suggestion is that people in the room and at home, if it's comfortable for you to do so, go outside and sit with a question or two that I'm going to leave you with, to just for your own percolation. There's a lot of listening that's happened this weekend. So you might want to journal, you might wanna sit on a bench. If you really must nap, let Marcel know if you have any insightful dreams. And the last thing I'll say is if you do this and then wanna share with someone, I'm gonna stay in the room till 3:15. You can talk to me, or if a few of you come back and want to sit together on a bench and share what came up for you. And likewise, folks on Zoom, you can work out, I know it's dinner time for many of you. If you wanna come back and talk to somebody in the room or talk to each other, we're gonna keep the Zoom room open as well. But here's my invitation, and tweak it as works for you. What are your current leadings in terms of the ministry of the word? And follow-up queries, what supports you to be faithful? And what inhibits being faithful for you?
Can you repeat the whole thing again, please?
Yeah. What are your current leadings in terms of the ministry of the word? Or Sam pointed out, it's not always words, whatever. What are you led in the way of communication? During these times of crisis and change, I'll add. And what supports you to be faithful and what inhibits faithfulness for you?